Reality check for us. And I grew up in the church, heard the sermons, but my parents divorced when I was 8, and so I had a loving, kind Christian mother who did what she had to do to raise. I'm one of 11, there was still 8 of us at home when my parents divorced. And so even though I grew up in a very loving Christian home with a single mom, there were a lot of times when I didn't know what was a fatherly decision and what was a motherly decision because my mother had to make all the decisions. And so with that, when Denise and I married, there were some complications. Denise had a little more distinct idea what was a fatherly decision and what was a motherly decision, and I didn't always see that. And so it took us a while. So some of the things we share with you, she and I learned through trial and error. Everything that I share with you will be based upon what God's already revealed to us. So let me just assure you, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to share with you some principles of how to. God's already told us what to do. I don't have that authority. I can't prescribe that for you. God's already done that. And so we're going to spend our time looking at some how-tos about becoming one and staying that way. We live in a society that doesn't know how to do that. And it's based on a lot of selfish motives. So we want to start where we should always start, and that's with the Scriptures. We won't read the whole context, but if you have your Bibles, if you turn to Genesis chapter 2, there's some very familiar things there to us. And we're talking about becoming one and staying that way. The very best place to start is where the first two became one, and what God prescribed for them to stay that way. You see, they obviously had some advantages because God created them, and He created them just like He wanted them to be, and they had no outside influences. They had no one to compare to. They had no one that they wanted to be like other than God. So they didn't have the complications that maybe you and I have when we're raised in a particular cultural context or a particular family context or particular societal context that confuses us sometimes. They didn't have that. You know, they were just like God wanted them to be. Now what you and I have to strive for once we look at Genesis chapter 2 is how do we, having influences in our life and maybe having made mistakes in how we started our marriages and are trying to function as husband and wife, how do we go back then and create that understanding of God's design for our marital relationship? God's the designer. If we're going to be one, and you look at the context of Genesis chapter 2, He describes it that way. When He placed Adam in the garden, and He allowed Adam to look at all of other creation, and there wasn't found anybody like Adam. In other words, there were all kinds of God's creatures that came before Adam, and they were paired up. You know, male and female. And He saw all those, and He named all of those, but there was not another humankind. It was almost as if God wanted him to absorb that, to see that, to understand that. I'm the only one of my kind. And then He made the statement, we'll talk about it a little bit more later, that it wasn't good for man to be alone. It wasn't good for Adam to be the only one of his kind. And He made him a helpmeet. Again, almost, as you look back at the context, so that there could be this distinction in Adam's mind to say, it wouldn't be good for me to be the only one of humankind. Particularly when he began to understand that everything produced after its kind and there was no other one of his kind. To appreciate that, to comprehend that, to value that. That becomes important. When you see God perpetuating that particular design, you understand that this wasn't just for Adam and Eve. Before the chapter closes, as He takes that rib out of Adam's side and He forms Eve and He gives her to Adam and they become one. He said, "Thus shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. In other words, that's to be perpetuated that way. Adam and Eve were to have a home, so when they produce after their kind, those children after their kind would grow up seeing how that husband and wife, as God made them, function as God intended for them to function. They could each leave their home and form a home. Now, the further away from that you get, the more complicated it gets, because you don't turn many pages in the Bible to people are tweaking God's plan somewhat. And they began to add things or take away things or become very selfish in their own motives, and that affects relationships, family relationships, affects their relationship to God. And that's where the complications come in. What you and I have to pay attention to is, yes, complications happen in life. Yes, you and I sin. But the great thing that we need to keep in mind is God has provided a means, a way for us to be like Adam and Eve was. Because when He created Adam and Eve, that discussion from a divine standpoint was, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Interesting. And so Adam and Eve were intended to be like God, to pure in their relationship with God. Can you and I have that? You see, if we start out here with our problems and we try to work back to God, there's too many distractions, too many voices, too much complication for us to get where we need to be. But if we go back to God's design to start with, and then we address our problems, there's a different outcome to those situations. You see, as a licensed counselor, I get folks who are out here, and there are a lot of chaos in their life, and there's a lot of complications in their life, and they want to correct those things where they are without ever realizing when there's a design to how that's to happen. Now, as a counselor, I can't always get them back to the Scriptures because there's not a history in their life where they've ever been at the Scriptures. So you have to start at a different place. But you and I can start here. We're assembled together to try to find out God's plan. To make sure that we don't lose sight of that, we see when we get to the New Testament, there are already complications. A lot of them, weren't they? Now, there are hundreds of years that have passed, and we read through the Scriptures, and there's a lot of chaotic things that go on in families. A lot of horrific things. Not only selfish things, but sinful things that happen in families. And so when you get to the New Testament and God comes to earth, and there's this conversation with the Son of God with those who live here, they came to Him in chapter 19 and they're asking Him with all these complicated situations. And they put this scenario before the Lord, here's what Moses said, and can a man put away his wife for any cause? And Jesus just simply said, have you not read? Read where? Just where we've read. Genesis chapter 2. Have you not read that He which made them at the beginning made them male and female? And then He rehearsed the last part of chapter 2. Why do you suppose God on earth, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, chose to take that complicated situation and not get in this long, drawn-out theological discussion with these doctors of the law, these folks who had manipulated things, and argue all the cases of the scenarios that existed in that time? He just simplified it. If you want what God designed for you to have, guess what you have to do? And this is not just a preacher saying, here's what we got to do. This is what the Son of God said. He just reminded us, have you not read? Now, if we just stay in our influences and our chaos, we're never going to solve it. It'll wear us down. We're going to be depressed. We're going to be mad at each other. We're going to blame it on each other. We're never going to solve any of our relational issues. There's a lot of complicated relational issues in Matthew chapter 19. And the Lord said, you just need to read what's been said. Now, I know to us, that's an oversimplification when there is immediate chaos in our lives. And there is a lot of conflict that's existed for a while. And we do get extremely irritated with each other, mad at each other, and sometimes so unhappy with each other we just don't want to be with each other. And you just want to say, it's just not worth it. You see, that's not the voice of God saying that. That's not the design of God saying that. And they were saying, Moses said we could put away our wives from any cause. Wonder what some of those causes might be. I tell you, Denise and I have had some situations where we could have given you some causes. I think I've always loved her. I think she's always loved me. But I know sometimes she doesn't like me. You know what I mean? She just doesn't like me. Because of a disposition, because of rudeness, because of impatience, for a lot of reasons. But you see, because the love's always been there, and the love's there because God designed it to be there. It's there. If we don't address it by starting with the design of God, then the love won't be there. And it'll just be superficial. We'll be trying to mechanically adjust things so we can just kind of function financially and try to function emotionally, or maybe function for the kids. And we might have a lot of reasons why we choose to function. But we're never really going to have what God had designed for us to have. And that's always sad to me. When I see couples that just don't enjoy what God always intended for them to enjoy. And because Denise and I have enjoyed it, then when any complications come up, we don't want to lose it. Now, if we'd never enjoyed it, we might not ever know what we're going to lose. So we have to take those things into consideration. When you turn to Ephesians chapter 5, I always thought it was a beautiful context where letters being written to a congregation of people at Ephesus. And in that letter, Paul uses some terminology to try to illustrate their relationship to Christ, and he emphasizes that husbands are to love their wives even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And what I try to emphasize to couples, and I've had the good pleasure over my ministry life to do a lot of premarital counseling with young couples. Done a lot of counseling with couples, but as soon as I started preaching, people assumed I knew how to counsel. And since I was married and had children, they thought I really knew everything about marriage and child rearing. And none of the above was true. I didn't have all the answers. I had a good working knowledge of the Scriptures because I'd spent 2 years in training and reading and studying and being tested on the Scriptures, so I had a pretty good knowledge of the Scriptures, but I had very little life experience. And they'd bring all these complicated issues to me. And I didn't know how to always respond. I could quote the Scriptures to them, and I could point them to the Scriptures, but the application in the everyday function, particularly for folks who had not grown up in a spiritual environment, it's like a foreign language to them. You keep quoting Scriptures, and you're going to drive them further away from things. You've got to give them some practical application. And so I went back to school just kind of out of self-defense, saying, okay, I'm going to damage somebody here. I'm going to push somebody over the edge. And they're just so emotionally distraught, and they're so hostile toward each other. They think I'm taking sides here. That's going to be the last straw. And now what do I do? Didn't have that life experience. And so I decided I was going to spend my emphasis and time, when I could, trying to take those who were going to get married, hadn't married yet, and spend my energy and time as much as I could in teaching these principles to them, so they could start their marriage right, they could design their marriage right, they could stay focused in their marriage right, and avoid many of these problems. So in this context, I try to emphasize to couples in Ephesians chapter 5 that in getting married, if you do it the right way, for the right reasons, if you function like you need to in that marriage, you get to represent to the world Christ's relationship to the church. To me, that's a whole different level to look at it. Paul's writing to Christians, and he said, husbands. Well, if you're a husband, then he's got your attention. Husbands, love your wives. Now, he didn't leave it there for us to say, well, how do you love your wife? Tell me how you love your wife. And you go around asking everybody how they love their wife, and you're going to get all these varying opinions about what they think love is. He didn't leave that to happen chance. Just like Jesus didn't leave the answer to the question they asked him about marriage to happen chance. He said, have you not read? And Paul is saying, husbands, love your wife as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Now, what do you suppose would happen? Just suppose every husband loved his wife the way Christ loved the church. Would you like to live in that world? Now, most of the women looking like yes. The husband's thinking, oh, now. Should have started with a wife. Started with a husband. Love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And then it tells the husband that they are to submit to their, tell the wives they are to submit to their husband. As the church submits to Christ. That's the context that you and I need to recognize is a powerful opportunity for us, is to get to be those representatives. And so it's not just me making sure I please my wife, even though that's my responsibility. That's my opportunity. That's my privilege. But it's more than that. You see, I can be more evangelistic if I am the right kind of husband. Because when I try to describe the church in its relationship to Christ, and they see me really love my wife, and I'm taking care of my wife, and I talk about how Christ is taking care and loves the church, they have some understanding of it. But if I'm using this verse with them and they see me mistreat my wife, kind of hard for them to understand that passage, isn't it? You see, it has to be God's design. It's a beautiful thing when it's God's design. If we tweak it, we change it, we alter it in any way, we lose something. We lose something in our relationship, and we lose something in our influence on others. So the time you've chosen to spend here this weekend can be valuable to you. Not just so your marriage can be better and your relationship can be improved and your communication skills be honed, but your relationship with God is going to be more what it ought to be. And your influence for God can be more what it ought to be. So those are important things for us to pay attention to. What we'll try to do, just so you think, where is he going? How long is he going to speak? About 45 minutes, maybe. Probably by a quarter till. We'll take a break. And we'll come back and spend maybe another 30 minutes, and that's all you have to worry about tonight. So you think, did anybody set a limit on this guy? You know? All you said is a marriage seminar, and he's going to just wear us down to we do what he tells us to do. And again, I didn't come to tell you what to do. I'm just going to share some how-tos with you. And I know they work because God designed them. I'm just going to share those with you. So keep that in mind. Paul emphasized its power and its potential that we can demonstrate to the world. We won't read all of chapter 5, but he continues to emphasize that. And the husband is to treat his wife like he'd treat his own body. Makes this real personal. And then in that same context, he said we are to submit to each other. We usually camp out on the wife submitting to the husband, don't we? But the same context said we are to submit to each other. And when we do that, we provide for each other what he always designed for us to provide. And that way we can have what he designed for us to have. It's always sad to me when people, for some reason, and I realize there are a lot of reasons. I've been blessed enough to have a good wife who has always cared for me and been patient with me. But I do know that there are complications in life that it can get bothersome, burdensome. And so I'm not making light of any situation, anybody's relationship. But if we go back to design, we can have what He said for us to have. Realize it takes both of us doing that. But the whole point is, that's why we're here this weekend. To say, how can we do that better? Even those of us who feel like maybe we've worked through some things and that we are at a better place, we can always be reminded of who we are and what we ought to be doing. And we can always learn to do it better. So I want you to keep those things in mind. There are some threats that come up as far as that oneness is concerned. And as a counselor, these are just the highlights. There are, a myriad of things that people bring. And if you're being trained in counseling, they'll say, there's a presenting problem, and then there's the problem. People will come and describe something to you as the problem, and when you start taking the layers off that onion, that's just what brought them to you. But there's a history there, that things that have been there for a long time that really have never been resolved. And so among those things, these are the major things that married couples come to me with. We'll break these down and do them individually, not tonight, but I'm just highlighting what we're going to do this weekend so you'll know what this guy is going to do. You'll know where this guy is headed. You'll know the subject matter we're going to talk about, and you'll know kind of the time frame we're going to be using. I won't wear you out, but I want to give you enough that you can go home and think about it and pray about it and study about it, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. But there are communication issues. They'll say, we just don't communicate. Well, that's a really broad statement. They sit in my office and I hear every word they say. They say it loudly. They say it fervently. But they say we don't communicate. And I hear every word they say. I understand every word they say. But they don't. So we'll talk about what that might mean and how we might address that. But that's a presenting problem. And we usually have to take the layers off the onion and say, what are we really talking about? What's really brought you here? Financial issues. We live in a society where, when Denise and I first married, you could not buy things on credit until you had a history. That always just boggled my mind. First time I tried to buy anything, they'd say, we need to see your credit history. I said, I don't have any. Well, we can't sell it to you. I said, well, how are you supposed to get credit history if nobody sells you anything? Well, come back to us when you get credit history. So we finally ended up talking a furniture store into selling us a couch and a chair. And that was our first history. And boy, now all you got to do, good credit, bad credit, we're going to keep having credit. And so we live in a society, and sometimes tragic things happen, and things that we had saved up and we thought we were going to be pretty secure, they evaporate, and there are complications that come up. But that affects relationships. It's strange relationship. Maybe one is trying to be disciplined and a good steward, the other is a spendthrift, or maybe the kids are sick, or somebody loses their job. A lot of things can happen, and it's strange. And so they come expressing financial issues, sexual issues. We live in a society where you can't even buy a bag of dog food without some sexual overtone to the dog food. If I need food for my dog, I don't need a woman that's demonstrating being disrobed to sell me dog food. In fact, I'd rather have a man in his overalls take my dog food out to the car for me. You know what I mean? But that's what society tries to do, and with that, our minds get somewhat polluted and perverted about sexual issues. And so they come in, society has told them this is what sexuality is, and they're dissatisfied because it's glamorized there and it doesn't have any meaning to them in a relationship. It's kind of mundane, it's kind of meaningless. Maybe both don't participate in it. And it's all because, I say all because, it stems back, have you not read? Well, God made us sexual being, but in an environment where it's gratifying to both. It's an intimate relationship that intended to bring happiness to both, and society doesn't look at it that way. So those are things that are complicated. And then they come to me oftentimes with just time management. They're going in all different directions and separated from each other. Kids are in this, and wives in this, and husbands in that, and they're just separated from each other. And they never spend time together. And it's complicated when they come because they're obligated, they think, in all these areas. And so they try to start out here to get back here, and we have to just say, what are the priorities? Let's start with the priorities. And then let's see what else we have time for. You see, those are the things that are threats to a relationship. That's not the way God designed it. With Adam and Eve, how much time did they have for each other? I mean, God just made them full-grown people. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. He made them full-grown people. How much time did they have for each other? Didn't have any friends down the street they had to spend time with. Didn't have any ball games to watch. Well, they might have gone fishing, I don't know. Whether they had been taught to do that or not, but God gave them all the knowledge He thought they ought to have for the function of the area. They were the only two there. Who are they going to spend time with? You, each other. So you see, that's where we have to start. You can't say, well, we got all these obligations and we just don't have time for each other. Boy, you can't ever be there. That's just not a place we can be. We have to start with time for each other, because that's where God started. Put them together. And He even said this is the way it's going to be perpetuated. Thus shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Well, they become one in that relationship, and that they spend that time together. Then they work other people in. Doesn't mean you can't ever see your mother and daddy. It just means mother and daddy are not priority anymore. This relationship is. We'll spend time this weekend talking about that. So there's an individual oneness, and that is this spiritual wholeness. Was God, when God created Adam, was he whole? Didn't create a little infant that evolved over time. He created a full-grown man, fully in His likeness. As spiritual as God wanted him. That was Adam. Whole. Called him Adam. Named him. We know he could function because everything that was created was presented to Adam, and he named it. Where did he get the names? Where did the vocabulary come from? What stimulated saying, this is, I don't know what he named them. You know, I know what we name things, but this is a tiger. You know, this is an elephant. Where did those things come from? Well, God. He made him fully whole, able to function that way. How is He going to make us spiritually whole? Got to go back. If you're not read, you got to go back and say, what did Adam have in that relationship to God? You kind of remove all the obstacles and all the opinions and all the voices and just say, with God and Adam in the garden, what was the conversation like? What was the relationship like? And so if we can do that as individuals, we'll have wholeness. And there's some ingredients that are involved in this oneness that we are to have, and that's a spiritual genetics. You know, and all physical genetics came from Adam and Eve. You know, we all descended from Adam and Eve. Doesn't matter what race we are. You know, it doesn't matter what nationality we live under today. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. We have genetic makeup. Who do we all descend from ultimately? Well, God. So spiritual genetics. What do they look like? You see, if we created His likeness, it ought to show up in our genetics. We're going to talk about that this weekend. We're going to look at the inspiration for oneness. And that's where we get into the spiritual communication. You see, if we can learn to listen to God, He's communicated with us, hasn't He? According to 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, all Scripture is given by the inspiration of God, literally meaning God breathed, and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God might be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto all good works. So there's some things that we're supposed to do and some responses we're supposed to have where we can be perfect. How is that possible? God's revealed design. How did Adam know how to be perfect? God's design. So we can get back to there as individuals, and that affects then our relationship as husband and wife. I want to spend a little time. This always kind of wrinkles the brains of young couples when I'm doing premarital counseling. Oh, by the way, you'd be interested to know, James mentioned that we met at the Memphis School of Preaching. When I taught, the 10 years I taught there, I would share my premarital material with the preacher students. And invariably, most of them would say, they'd come back to me privately. I guess they didn't want the other preacher students to know that they had additional material, you know, and so they'd come back and say, Brother Martin, boy, I really appreciate you sharing this premarital counseling material with me. Do you have anything on marital counseling if somebody's already married? I said, I do. I'd go to my computer and I'd pull up the premarital counseling, and at the top where it says premarital counseling, I would delete the pre. And I said, there it is. So you see, if we're having problems after we married, we need to go back and see what God said. That's what we all have to do. Not just before we marry. After we marry, we have to go back and say, have you not read? What did God say? Now, if we learn to do that together, then it doesn't appear like I'm telling my wife what to do. And it doesn't appear that she's bossing me around. God's the one telling us what to do. If both of us respect that God tells us what to do, then I'm not going to argue with God. Are you? Well, I have to take that back. There have been times when I argued with God. I don't think that's right. Why are people treating me that way? You know, I'm doing the best I can. Why is this person being blessed? And so I guess I have, on occasion, argued with God. But it's been futile. So when I go back and see what He says, it hasn't changed. And every time, without exception, when I do what God tells me to do, it always turns out the way God promised it to turn out. There's not an exception to that. So when you think about it that way, this is the part that kind of wrinkles the brains of the young couple. What I do is I've got 5 lessons that I share with them, and if they want me to perform their wedding ceremony, I won't agree to perform the ceremony unless they have those 5 sessions with me. I want 7, but I'll take 5 because I've got 5 written lessons. And in those written lessons, the very first one, they learned about this Genesis chapter 2. And what we've often done in the church is we've implied, sometimes we say it, but we often imply it, that God said it wasn't good for man to be unmarried. And that's not what He said. After Adam had absorbed being the only one of his kind, He said it wasn't good for man to be alone. Because when you look at what it means to be single, it means to be separate, unique, and whole. How did God make Adam? Separate, unique, and whole. And after He made him, He said it's good. So it is good to be separate, unique, and whole. But alone means, He said it wasn't good for man to be alone. And that is exclusive, isolated, and solitary. Wasn't good for him to be the only one of his kind. You'd find this humorous, but here's what we do in the church, is we use that word single to mean unmarried. You know, and say, it's not good to be unmarried. Because God said it wasn't good to be unmarried. He never said that. Because you see, if a person's not ready as a whole, unique person, then they don't need to be married. Again, keep in mind, Adam and Eve had this unique privilege of being absolutely whole, absolutely unique. absolutely without any kind of influences outside of God's influence. And so they were just like God wanted to be. Then He put them together. Because those two whole unique individuals could then provide what a relationship would have to survive. And so that's what the impression I try to make on these young people is to know the difference in those words. And sometimes they come back and say, I really wasn't sure what point you're trying to make. And so we talk about, do you feel like you're whole, unique in your relationship to God? Do you think you like God wanted you to be? Well, I'd like to be there one day and say, well, before He performed a wedding ceremony, He made them just like He wanted them to be. Well, I don't know if I could ever be like that. Well, God, according to 2 Timothy chapter 3, God says we can be perfect. That His breathed message can provide everything we need. So we spend some time sometimes in studying the Scriptures. If there are things in there they need to be enlightened by, this has to happen. And let me just go ahead and say, because you think, oh, he's going to spend this week and just beat me up all weekend, and that's not the point. Because we serve a gracious, forgiving God, and when I married my wife, I wasn't a whole, unique, complete person. You see, I had some selfish motives for marrying my wife. There's some things that I had in mind about what a perfect marriage ought to be, and most of them involve what she could provide for me. Pretty selfish. I didn't go back and read again, even though I'd been taught the Scriptures. I didn't go back and read them and say, okay, am I who God wants me to be so that I can provide what God expects me to provide for this woman who is striving to be everything God wants her to be and will provide what God intended for her to provide so that we together can provide for this relationship what it ought to have? Right over my head. I thought, she's beautiful. I'll be happy forever with her because here's what she can provide for me. Extremely selfish, isn't it? And most of us begin there. It's physical attraction, it's sexual attraction, and nothing wrong with any of those things if you are two whole, unique individuals. Before you beat yourself up, because I beat myself up, is if you're not, even though you've been married a number of years, if you're not presently, you can become whole, unique, and complete. So you can't, oh, I missed the ship, it's already sailed, too late. No. My wife and I are living examples that you can change things. You can make sure that the relationship's what it ought to be, but that cannot happen until the two of you have the relationship to God that God really designed for you to have. It just can't happen. Now, people are married who don't even accept that God exists. And they can have a relationship. And they can even have joy and happiness in a relationship, but they're never going to have what God intended for them to have in its fullest meaning without both of them being fully connected to God. Just like God wanted them to be. That's the point we're going to make. And we can spend some time making sure that we embody those things. The ingredients are involved. If we are those whole, separate, unique individuals, then you give birth to a relationship. Again, we'll spend more time branching this out. I just want to introduce you to what we're going to be talking about. That relationship will be totally dependent upon those two individuals. If they're less than whole and unique, the relationship is going to have less than what God designed for it to have. And so you want to make sure that you do your part to provide what it needs to provide. There's some laws that govern the growth and development of our physical existence. And, there are textbooks written, and there are courses you take, and there are degrees that you can earn about human growth and development. And there are natural stages that we go through in order to fully develop. And there are certain stages where children think very concretely. You can't talk to them in abstract terms. They can't comprehend that. If you talk about somebody dies and grandpa dies and he's asleep, you tell the child he's asleep, the child's going to get frightened and won't go to sleep because they think very concretely. Sometimes in relationships, we have to realize that there's a growth and development process. You cannot financially have what your parents have and they worked 30 years to get. You can't have that. There's some growth and development has to take place. You can't fully understand that relationship. You know, under the Jewish law, the man who married, took a wife, was released from outside duties. Didn't mean he released from his duties taking care of his family or his wife. He was released from going to war, those other obligations outside that relationship, because he had to concentrate on that relationship. It says specifically so he could cheer his wife up. And that's kind of the Old Testament application of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7. That husbands are to dwell with their wives according to knowledge. Did you know what people who come to me with needing marital counsel say? I just don't understand her. I don't get her. Boy, men just can't understand women. And I say, we have to. What do you mean you have to? The inspired Scripture said I have to. I have to dwell with her according to knowledge. Well, I just don't think you can do that. Oh, yes, you can do that. And we're going to talk this weekend about how you do that, the how-tos. How do we understand each other? Those are important things for us to pay attention. I'm watching the clock, by the way, so you don't have to. In that relationship, the handout that I give, the lesson that I give the young couples that are coming to me for premarital counseling, in this giving birth to a relationship, I try to emphasize to them that when they get married, here's some things. And each of these ingredients are spelled out in the material, and I won't spend a whole lot of time on that, but they talk about commitment, and they talk about honesty and responsibility and independence and sensitivity and temperance, and be impressionable at what the other person's feeling and saying makes an impression on you, to stay active, and to be nurturing. And when they finish their study, there's a little acrostic in the review that when they fill in these words, they see that it says Christian. You're talking about those spiritual genetics, remember? What should it look like? Husbands, love your wives the way Christ loved the church. Be like Christ. Wives, submit yourself to your own husband as unto the Lord. Be like Christ. You see, Christ was submissive, wasn't he? Even to the death on the cross. So everything involves these spiritual genetics that we ought to be able to see that in us. That takes that personality out of it, where it looks like one of us is trying to tell the other what to do. It looks like one person is getting all the privileges from the relationship. If we put it in the right context, the way God designed it, it's going to be beautiful and enjoyable. But boy, if you're out here where it's not beautiful, it's not enjoyable, and we try to take our time and work all the way back here, likely we won't make it, because too many distractions, too many voices, too many hurt feelings, too many scars. But if we say, hey, we're both going to go right back here where everything starts. And then we're going to reconnect to relationships that are healthy, a communication that provides what God intended for us to provide in our conversation with each other, and we'll be then who God wants us to be. Those become important things. I mentioned a moment ago, and so this is just the break slide, so we'll know we're going to take a break. Here are the things that are threats to a relationship. So when we come back, we're going to take the first one. We're going to spend the rest of our evening defining, understanding, and then I'll send you something home for you to practice communication. Say, oh, brother, he's going to tell me something I got to talk about. You know, I knew, honey, you promised me you wasn't going to be any of that touchy-feely stuff, you know. But I told you. I don't know what you told each other. Because some of you probably asked the preacher elders, what's this going to be about? What's a marriage seminar? Yeah, that's pretty broad. About what? So I'm telling you, but I'm going to share with you some how-tos. What I'll send home with you tonight is a how to understand each other so that you can communicate with each other. Non-threatening. You're not going to have to read a whole textbook. You're just going to answer a few questions, and hopefully that'll be enlightening. But we'll take the first one of those after the break, and we'll talk about communication. The others we'll look at tomorrow sometime during the day, starting in the morning. So you can take a break now. See, that wasn't too bad, was it? We'll take a break, probably, let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back and pick up there.